Yeah, so hi everyone and welcome to our series where we interview computer science faculty about their job search and interview experience to help future faculty candidates prepare for their job season. And today we are here with Talia Ringer, who will start as a tenure track assistant professor at UIUC next semester. Talia's main research is on program verification using proof assistance. So welcome Talia, and it's great that you are participating in this series.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, perhaps we could start by you telling us a bit about yourself.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Talia. As you said, I'll be starting at UIUC in the fall. I went to University of Washington for my PhD, so I just finished up this June in the middle of the pandemic. uh, Before that, I was a software engineer at Amazon for 3 years, so I have a little bit of industry experience. And I went to Maryland for undergrad, did both math and computer science. Yeah, I like to run and play dancing games and write poetry and forage mushrooms.
Okay, cool. And also, what is your research on?
Yeah, so my work is on verification, as you said. So in particular, what I do is I work on proof engineering technologies, so technologies that make it easier to develop and maintain systems that you verify using these proof assistants. So my emphasis throughout my PhD was on making it easier to maintain verified systems. So in particular, when you use these proof assistants, you can write your program in the proof assistant, then specify something you want to prove, and then write a proof that shows like your program satisfies your specification. So it actually does what you said it does. Uh, and what I do is make it, so when you change, at some point, you might change the thing that you want to prove, or you might change the program itself. And the focus of my work is how do you adapt the proofs to those changes as automatically as possible. So my thesis is on what I call proof repair, which is like a kind of proof automation that actually understands how these systems change and that will help you adapt them in response to changes.
I see. I mean, you will be joining soon. So for the first semester, will you already be teaching classes?
I have a weird start date
Mhm.
because I finish in June because University of Washington was on a quarter system. I asked for a start date a little bit later than the beginning of the fall semester. So I technically start in like October. So I'll start teaching in January. And I think it's nice for me. It gives like a little bit of time to ease into things.
And I guess it's also then the teaching release or a teaching release that you used for your first semester, or
No, because of the weird start date, I don't have to. I think that I can use that later.
Mhm. Okay, nice that
Yeah.
it worked out like this. At least gives you some more time for yeah, getting research hands-on bootstrapped.
Yeah, I think the thing I was most worried about was spending my whole summer because of the June graduation date, and it would have been an August start date. I didn't want to spend my whole summer preparing a class and not get a chance to take a break or anything.
Yeah, and regarding a start date, so I noticed on your Twitter feed also that you have a start date in July 26th as an adjunct assistant professor with a 0% appointment, right? So I think there is a funny anecdote behind that.
Yeah, I think it's just some of the weird like administrative details of being faculty that you kind of don't anticipate ahead of time. I don't remember which of these things it was, but I have a grant that I applied for when I was at UW, and it's like I was like played a really primary role in the grant application. And so the agreement with all the faculty, it was like, well, wherever Talia ends up at Talia University, like we called it for a while, um, like I would become a PI, and this was all budgeted in, um, and communicated transparently to everyone. Um, but then the kickoff for the actual grant is like in July. So in order, I think, to submit everything and have me be a PI at Illinois, I think I had to like technically be faculty. Apparently 0% faculty is faculty. Yeah, and then it's also I think also helps me pay. There's a former undergrad who I worked with at UW, who graduated and is working like part time on a a project that we were working together on, and I was like, I'd like to pay him. So I think that also helps me actually access the money to do that.
And was this something easy, like to communicate and set up, or did this cause some headache?
I think it was easy. I think especially stuff like the grant, like if you tell a university like I have some money, they're not gonna be
Things
like,
automatically
no,
work.
we don't want the overhead, Yeah. Like I mean half joking, but yeah, I think people were really flexible and helpful with this.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. Like you have initiated amazing mentoring and diversity initiatives. For example, the SIGPlan long-term mentoring program. So first of all, could you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this program, which I call SIGPlan M, it's now been around for about a year. So I started it last year. And the idea is it matches mentors with mentees in the programming languages research community for relationships lasting about a year by default. Although you can exit more like earlier if it's not working out, and you can renew at the end of the year. The whole idea is to kind of address like a couple of gaps in mentoring in the community. So the first is like the need for like a long-term external mentor, someone who can give you complementary perspective outside of your institution, someone you can talk to about things that might be hard to talk to about people in your institution, and who's actually there for a long period of time, as opposed to just like a mentoring workshop before a conference where you might never talk to that person again. And then it also it like it helps people who traditionally might have had difficulty finding mentors in the community. So both people who, I don't know, maybe they're like software engineers who want to come back and go into academia, and like it's impossible without a connection, or like faculty. So we have a number of faculty mentees. At first, only junior faculty, and I think at this point it includes even some like tenured faculty. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's
that's
nice to
interesting.
have this whole range of like, I think it's like high school through senior faculty at this point.
And
Yeah.
I'm curious, so during, for example, the one-on-ones, is this something that you often discussed about, or?
Yeah, I mean, so this played I think a big role in like I mean, I definitely talked about it in my diversity statement. Um, and then it came up, it depended on, I think, like who I was talking to. Some people would ask about it, some people would not. I think it did help in some ways, like there was actually one university I interviewed at where because of the pandemic, they had some like restrictions on hiring that year, and like they specifically were interviewing people who had like really strong mentoring experience.
I, I
Which
guess
was
your
like a
profile is hard to beat then.
it was kind of funny, yeah. So like I think those things, like, I mean, obviously I didn't start this program like thinking about how it would help me, but like I think it did help. I think there's also just kind of it got my name out there like very, very far. I think it's a very visible role. Like I do like monthly check-ins with all the mentors and mentees, and so I'm just every month or so I'm emailing all these faculty and students and so on.
And during the job talk, could you also incorporate this somehow, or?
Yeah, I didn't end up doing that. Yeah, I mean, I think if I wanted to, I would have had it in like just before the future work part of the job talk. I had like a let's back up and talk about how I got here to begin with, and it was just kind of a brief like history of I used to do research in cryptology, and then I went to Amazon, and then my first couple papers and so on, and like I probably could have snuck it in there. I think it didn't seem like the emphasis of the job talk. Yeah, I mean, it was fine. I think it was in my diversity statement, and in places where they didn't explicitly take a diversity statement, I usually just included one anyways. I don't know if they read it, but
Yeah,
yeah. And then it would
makes
come
sense.
up, and people would ask me just questions about diversity, and I'd talk about kind of the things I'd done.
Yeah, makes sense. You have ADHD and are very open about it. So I believe this is great, basically, by creating this awareness and also being a role model for other neurodivergent folks. And I also learned a lot about it by yeah, following your Twitter posts and so on. And I believe that this also must have affected your job search and interviewing process in some ways. So
Yeah.
yeah, first of all, could you explain to us like how ADHD affects you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's almost hard to think about how it doesn't affect me.
Oh, yeah, right.
So because I do think like some things about it are good. So like I think I read a paper and on the third page I have like 20 ideas of like
Mhm.
things I want to do. Now it's often really hard to finish the paper because then I feel like I have to go read everything about this one idea that I have, or go onto Twitter and ask everyone whether this thing has been done, and then go down a giant rabbit hole. Um, but I think it helps with the kind of creativity parts. And another thing is like I don't know, it's depending on how you look at it, like either impulsivity or like fearlessness.
Mhm.
Like a lot of people when they have ideas, immediately start to think of like, well, what happens if I try this and it goes wrong? What if this is too hard? And I kind of don't get there. Like I have an idea and I'm like, I'm going to do this right now. Um, and I like that. I mean, it's like why I started this mentorship program, and it's why I get to work on some like problems that people consider hard sometimes. Uh,
But I
yeah, and
mean,
then
for your future research, it's also you are now also going in the machine learning direction, right? Coming from a program verification. So that's also, yeah, a big
yeah,
step.
yeah, just throwing myself into a totally different research area once in a while, and looking for intersections. Like, I think because of like the disinhibition, the like impulsivity, it feels like I am always able to form connections between things that people might not immediately consider like connected to each other. So I can see like what the intersection of type theory and machine learning looks like, and I'm excited about it. Um, yeah, no, there are definitely downsides. So like I mean, organization is just really hard. um and like, so some of it is like, I don't know, like emails. It's just like, I think emails are hard for everyone, but like, oh my god, I struggle so much. And I have to put everything in my calendar or on a task list, or I will just literally forget that it exists. Like, um, I lose things all the time. Yeah, I needed like quiet office space. I couldn't work in like we have a lab that's just a lot of people talking all the time, and I love it. And I would go in there like for lunch and so on. But um, oh my God, there's no way that I could actually work there. There's something else that was important. Oh yeah, like, oh, the pandemic. I think working from home was just literally impossible. Like there's just no way I could have ever done it. And I know a lot of people who succeeded, and um I just had to like ask between the ADHD and like, and also some depression stuff. Like I had to ask for accommodations, like please let me come into an empty office and just work by myself. And then it was fine. But uh yeah, I know other people with ADHD who like didn't get this accommodation, and some people like dropped out or had to go on leave.
Mhm.
So I feel really fortunate that I got that.
Like, are there any special strategies that you can recommend to other folks with ADHD? I mean, for emails and so on, or I mean, you already said using a calendar and a task list. That's one of the
Yeah.
things, but I also do this, and I would also not survive without it. But are there any other kind of strategies that you can recommend?
It's really hard. Email has been one of the harder ones, especially because it just grows over time. I often ask the other person to actually send the meeting invite and stuff because um if yeah, I don't know, it turns out it's like a lot of overhead to do this myself. If my email gets out of hand, then I will just never get to it. So I try to always, like, I have like a number, it's like 10 in my university email, and it's like I just try to every day to get it below 10 on read emails.
Mhm.
And I'll move things from emails to tasks. It's still really time consuming. Yeah, I mean, asking for accommodations, I think, was important. Not being afraid to ask for a quiet workspace, not being afraid to ask to come in, um, really like articulating my needs. This ended up being really important. I think another dimension I forgot to mention, it's like a lot of people with ADHD have this thing called uh, like rejection sensitive dysphoria. I don't know if have you heard about this?
No, not yet.
Okay, yeah, it's just like if there's like someone you respect or like you care about their opinion, and then you know you perceive that like they're rejecting you, it's like this intense like intense emotional reaction to rejection, like a feeling of like I've heard this from other people, and it's also how I feel. It's like it's brief, but it feels like someone has died. Like
Well,
it's really painful. Um, and I think in general, like a lot of people with ADHD have trouble with emotional regulation. So like if I get sad at work, I might just cry in front of people.
mhm, I
If I
see.
get excited, I'll be like, you know, really visibly excited. But it just like there's not the part of my brain that's like don't show that feeling. It's like really I just can't do it. um but so yeah, I mean with rejection you get this like really intense feeling. It's like more, I think it's like almost everyone with ADHD um has this. And then like you and then yeah, you also end up showing it because you don't have the part of your brain as much that can like really stop it from being shown. So I ended up needing, you know, for a while I'd formed this, so this comes up, for example, like it came up with my advisor sometimes, where he would give feedback. And if it didn't have like a collaborative frame, like we're working together on this thing, then I would sometimes feel like I had failed him or something. And I would get like really sad about it. Um, and I developed this coping mechanism, which turned out not to be a good one for him, where I would kind of, instead of getting argumentative or anything like that, I would kind of talk about like broken systems that we need to fix.
Mhm.
Like, oh, well, peer review is just broken. We need to fix that. um, and and he would think that it was kind of me bumping it up to the, you know, like not taking responsibility for things for a while. And then eventually, you know, I figured out, oh, this is like this rejection sensitive dysphoria, this reaction just doesn't make sense. And we talked about it and we set communication norms that like really worked for us. um, and I think that was really important, like just having communication norms with the people that you're closest with that are actually cognizant of like the emotional dimensions of ADHD. Sorry, that was very long-winded, but that's the conclusion.
Yeah, sounds very helpful to understand this. I guess also
Yeah.
then communication is key with talking with advisor and so on, and yeah, setting this kind of norms also. Yeah. And how did this affect like your experience of the interviewing process and so on? I mean, I remember, for example, that on your again on Twitter that you posted about that it would be helpful for you to have some administrative help. And
Yeah.
did you, for
Yeah.
example, negotiate something like this?
Yeah. Yeah. So for the administrative help, yeah, I ended up at the places where I had offers, asking, basically asking, you know, would your existing like administrative setup support like, you know, if I need like roughly half an hour a day of someone helping me organize my life, you know,
Mhm.
mostly like around work, obviously, but, you know, planning emails and so on. Um, and one place said yes. So in that point, I didn't have to negotiate more. It was just like, okay, you know, this will be my need, and like you should know this. This was after offers, though. The other two were like no, and then at that point, I think I asked for a bump in startup that would that would have let me pay to hire my own part-time admin. No, yeah, I didn't end up needing this at UIUC because they just have a lot of administrative support by default. But in some places, I needed that. It's unfortunately just not considered like a so-called like reasonable accommodation um, by most people for the ADA, which is kind of silly to me because it's like um, executive functioning, like managing things is like literally just the hardest part
Right. Yeah.
about working with ADHD. But yeah, it's not, it doesn't fall under that. But you do have negotiation power once you have offers, and I think that was really helpful. And I'm hoping, you know, it's kind of it's hard to be like I have, you know, this kind of disability, I have these needs, like it can be scary. But I hope if there's more of a norm of like negotiating for these things, then maybe places will start offering it more freely.
Mhm.
Yeah. you also asked about how it impacted the actual like job search, like interviewing and stuff. And one thing that I think that I didn't know until the pandemic is like roughly, I don't know the exact prevalence, but I think it was like roughly half of people with ADHD have audio processing disorder. So it's like, it's not like you're hard of hearing or anything, like the actual like hearing is fine, but it's difficulty kind of distinguishing sounds, like understanding that these are particular words and so on. So for my whole life, I watched TV with captions, and I thought this was just like everyone watches TV with captions. During the pandemic, I realized if I have one Zoom meeting without captions, it's like okay. If I have a day without captions, I just can't figure out what anyone is saying by the end. It's like so cognitively intense to try to make out all these words. It's easier in person when you have like more, I think it's easier to tell from other cues like reading lips or body language what people are saying. So yeah, I ended up requesting captions at all my interviews, and this was like immensely helpful.
Actually, can I turn on captions here?
Yeah, it would be helpful. I don't know, not every Zoom has it.
Let me check. Based on this, are there also any kind of advice that you can give for institutions on like what to do for candidates with ADHD? I mean, we already mentioned captions are helpful. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, captions were good. I think in general, it'd be nice if the process of like asking for accommodations were a little bit easier. Every place was good about it. Like there was no place that because they want you to have a good time, because like you know, if they end up liking you, then they want you to come. And so every place was nice when I asked for accommodations, but it's still really intimidating when you're being judged and you have to ask them to like do this thing for you. And then especially like weirder ones that people haven't heard of, like you know, I have no like hearing difficulties at all, but like I have trouble processing audio and I need captions. And like people, not to say it's weird, it's like it's common, but people don't know as much about this. And it yeah, I feel like it felt internally like I'm being needy and they might not you know maybe it's silly, but like what if they just don't, if it forms a negative impression somehow. I feel like if it were a little more systematic and like kind of the norm that they ask you to tell them exactly what it is that you'll need, and make it clear that this isn't going to impact the actual like judgment or anything. I think that could help. It's interesting. I think it's hard because I think a lot of the things are also things that people would judge you for like subconsciously. So like, for example, I have these things that I'm playing with right now. And I always have to be doing something with my hands when I talk. Like I just can't like, especially when I'm thinking or when I give a talk or whatever, I had to be doing something with my hands. So my default is actually to play with my hair. There's a societal interpretation of playing with your hair that's like playful or flirtatious, which are just not what you want to be communicating, during a job interview. So at like Rising Stars Career Workshop, I ended up talking to someone who advised that I always like hold a pen when I'm in meetings and interviews. And now when I give talks, I have my clicker in one hand and I have a pen in the other hand. And it's like kind of strange, but no one really thinks about it. Yeah, sometimes if people aren't going to see it, then I like to play with something like this where it's just really like tactile. It helps. I think, yeah, it's like, it's hard because then it's like, how do you get people to reinterpret like societal interpretations of things, like playing with a bright orange spiky bracelet or playing with your hair when you talk. And I wish I knew. I don't.
I see. Yeah, but for that it's helpful that you communicate for example these kind of things on Twitter, and hopefully also this interview.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, the pen was really helpful. I also have some other ones, like Let me see if I can find it. I have one that like looks like a clicker. It's like, it's so inconspicuous. I love it. Uh, so like this one I got on Amazon. It was really cheap. Um, and it like, so it has this button and some buttons here and a little like trackpad thing that you can, or whatever it's called, like a little joystick. It's really fun to play with, and I think it really like, it looks like something that I would use to control a slide or something. So it kind of has like an authoritative feeling. If I just had this in one hand, I don't think anyone would. Maybe it just looks really fancy, like I'm doing two-handed controls of my slides.
I see.
Yeah.
And since you also, I mean, it goes in another direction, but since you also just mentioned the Rising Star program, so can you also tell us a bit about the program itself, first of all?
Yeah. Rising Stars is a workshop. I think at this point for all gender minorities in computer science, who are interested in becoming faculty and are like a year or two out from the job application process. And or maybe it was, maybe a year or two out from graduating or finishing a postdoc. I don't know. I did it in 2019, I think. It was really helpful. It was actually at UIUC. So it's nice. I mean, you meet people. You meet a lot of people. You get on a lot of like recruiting lists. You also get just really good advice and a lot of help. So there were like a number of talks and panels. I think the most helpful thing for me was actually like they had these like one-on-one mentoring sessions that you could do. And I just asked for like practice one-on-ones. Like I want to know what a one-on-one for a job interview is like so that my first one isn't, high stakes. And so it felt a little weird to like get into that mindset, knowing that it was like staged, but I think it ended up being really useful. And then at the end, I'd actually ask for feedback, like, okay, what is it that, I did well? What could I have done better? And I think I learned a lot of surprising things, like not just things like holding a pen, which is all from one of those practice one-on-ones, but also like, um, I don't know, when I talk about my future work in a talk, I'm usually going to start from the closest thing and then incrementally build up to the thing that's, further away, the like long-term vision. Um, when I'm giving a talk, or when I'm in a one-on-one meeting, if I approach it this way, then someone might get really caught up on a point from like, my 1 or 2 year plans. And we might dive into that forever and we might never get to like my long-term vision. And then they might enjoy the conversation, but might leave with an impression of like, not having a lot of long-term vision. Because so like at that point it was like, I learned that it helps if I kind of start big and then let people ask questions. And then when they ask questions, I can kind of go into the particular, shorter term plans that they seem most interested in.
That's really excellent advice, because I think it happened to me several times that, like you said, we would only talk about the closest thing that I would do next, also in one-on-one meetings.
Yeah.
It's a good strategy. So you're openly bisexual, and I imagine that this must have also influenced the job search or interviewing process in some ways. I mean, anyway, all of us want to work in welcoming environments, but of course, I think you have to go one step further to really ensure that there are like no abusive faculty at the institution. So
Yeah.
how did this basically influence your job search?
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, it's really hard to get an honest answer on on whether there are like troublemakers in the department. I think I'd usually pick someone who I found kind of trustworthy to talk about this kind of thing. And then someone just like really active in diversity work, or maybe someone else who's openly queer. I love when people will make it known that they're openly queer before interviewing, because then it's like really nice to be able to ask those questions. But it's not always common. But yeah, then I would ask like I would ask people about faculty who had caused problems, or what do you do if you um, if a faculty member tells you that people of an entire group of people, like women or like LGBT people or something, are like not as good at computer science, or um, and like how do people deal with this kind of thing? And then usually if there were concrete examples, people would bring them up. But it's hard because they also have an incentive to really make a good impression. I think this stuff also, it goes a little bit better on like second visits. It feels a little scary to bring up in the interview, although I did sometimes, and sometimes it was really good. Like I met with Nancy, who's the head of computer science at UIUC, and I kind of asked the generic, like, so what do you do for diversity question, because it's a nice way to get like by being so open-ended, you kind of you get a sense of what people prioritize. And one thing I looked for is like, a lot of people, when they think about diversity, they only think about the kind of recruitment part of things, like how do we get more women, how do we get more like LGBT people, and like all these, it's always about recruitment, and then not as much about how do we actually make sure that the environment is safe and healthy. How do we prevent people from ending up dealing with abusive people at work? And like, so I was really really pleased when Nancy started talking about her like confidential advocate plans like to deal with abusive people. And to me that was like a really good sign that like someone high up was actually really seriously thinking about this. And then we had a fantastic conversation like all about that, and I sent her this long email with advice on confidential advocate systems, because I think about this stuff all the time. That was really exciting. I think another place that the LGBT thing came up in particular is like just thinking about where I'm moving, and not as much whether it's friendly, because I think for most university towns in the US at least happen to be in places that are also like fairly good places to be LGBT. Although you do have to look at like local laws and so on. But in particular in some places, so I'm like, I'll be single when I start as faculty, and in some places it felt almost like I felt very torn. Like at the end I was down between two universities, and one of them was in a town that has a nickname of Lesbianville, USA, which is like fantastic. For me, like I prefer dating women, and it would have been like a place where I felt really like I could be myself. And then Urbana-Champaign is really not like that. Like it's going to be difficult, I think, to find same-sex partners. And it's interesting because as a bi person, I like on one hand I have this privilege of being able to not do that if I like if I'm in a place where I only have opposite sex partners available. But on the other hand, it felt like there's a small part of me that's like I'm betraying myself. like I'm letting go of a part of me. And it's not like there are no queer women in Urbana-Champaign. There are. Like it's just much smaller, and I kind of felt like an internal guilt almost for not choosing like the queer place.
Yeah, it's always difficult.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of guilt. I mean, I was in a really good position, I will say. Like I'm very very lucky to feel torn. I feel like if you can feel torn in the job search, like that's really good, because it usually means there are two places where you feel like you'd be happy at least. But yeah, I felt so much guilt for not being able to say yes to both of them in the end.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very similar here. Yeah. One thing that I also wanted to mention is, I mean, you're using Twitter a lot. And I just wondered, like, what was your general kind of experience with using Twitter to inform many of your decisions or communicate, and also like what kind of advice do you have for other faculty candidates on how to use such platforms?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So I will say, yeah, a lot of my Twitter use, it really went wild during the pandemic because I used to have this lab where if I had a curiosity about something, I could just wander in and yell out some idea and then, see who wanted to talk, and then we could talk about it. And like you lose that during the pandemic. You're so isolated. Um, and uh, I really ended up using Twitter as a replacement for that. Um, and in some ways it's really good. Like it's incredible for like promoting your work, crowdsourcing ideas, like finding relevant papers to read, exposing yourself to research that you might not have immediate access to, like immersing yourself in other communities. That stuff is great. And also you can interact with like researchers that you would have considered like famous and realize that they're just people, and they have Twitter accounts like this. Yeah, on the other hand, it's like I had some bad experiences too, I think, because I didn't understand just how vulnerable you can be to like online harassers. uh, so I had a situation where there's one faculty member um, at UW who had kind of internally like just been really kind of mean to people, had done a lot of like trolling of mailing lists and so on. And eventually it kind of stopped him from doing that within UW. And now he just decided to go to Twitter instead. And so I had like 6 years of context of like, oh, this is exactly what he does. So when I saw him doing this and trying to kind of bully people on Twitter and troll them, I just kind of gave context immediately, like this is what he does. This is, you should be aware if he tries to do this to you, this is what's going on. And this this other guy, not the actual person that I was kind of giving context for, but this online harasser, Michael Lissack, and there are all these articles on this now and on him. Like he kind of picked up on this, saw what I was doing, and then decided that he was going to tell everyone on Twitter um, over and over again. He like found my diversity statement where I talked about like my experiences with like mental illness, like severe depression, PTSD, and he found these and he started like telling everyone on Twitter, all over Twitter, that I was mentally ill and like not fit for employment. He did this for like a few, yeah, like just like hundreds of tweets like this, and then started like he emailed me and threatened to contact potential employers. And this is all during my job search.
Wow, yeah,
Yeah, and
terrible
so
person and experience.
yeah, so like I ended up just owning the narrative, and like I hadn't planned to be out about mental illness and stuff until after I got a job, because it felt like it made me kind of vulnerable. But I decided to just own it. I was like, yes, I have depression, PTSD, this is why. And kind of explain that he was being really disrespectful in this way. And then media picked up on it. And then I was in news articles. And then I talked to everyone who was involved in like because this guy was also harassing like Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell and so on. So I got wrapped up in that. And like, it was just way over the top. Just what a thing to deal with during a job search. And it ended up okay. And like, I hear people get, like search committees get emails like this from harassers that are like, don't hire this person, and they just ignore those emails. They're not like impactful, thankfully, but it was scary for a little bit. I think the big thing I took away with that was like, there's a certain amount of, you need a certain amount of power on in your life to be able to tweet publicly about certain issues. And if you're not careful with that, like it can hurt you. And so I think just being aware of like the consequences of like, you know, there are people out there who are very malicious. You should know they exist.
Yeah, sounds like a terrible experience, and yeah, amazing job that you are doing with all of this. So yeah, I would say we have talked now quite a bit about some general aspects during your job search and beyond that. So perhaps let's continue with some questions about starting with the preparation phase. And there, as a first question, like what were your considerations when preparing your job talk? How did you structure it, for example?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was lucky enough that I gave a similar talk like a year out. Like UMass Amherst invited me for this lecture series where I was kind of able to give my like job talk, but a year early. And this I really recommend, because my first take, like before the actual lecture series, was terrible. Like I gave a practice talk to my lab, and I got a message from my advisor, which I rarely get these. So when he would send them, I would know he was being serious. But he was basically like I know you worked really hard on this, but you know, you kind of need to rewrite the whole thing. And I had like a week before this talk at UMass Amherst, and I think the thing I hadn't thought about was like all the talks I'd written in my entire life had been for these audiences who really know a lot about my work, and suddenly I had to give a talk to a much more general audience, and I had no idea how to communicate that kind of thing yet. So it was the week I worked like harder than I could have ever imagined. But then the talk at UMass Amherst went really well. But yeah, I was learning a lot of things, like I can't just show code from my proof assistant of choice, you know, to like just large amounts of code to people who have never seen this before. Like I might have to, I translate things when I do have to show code, I like translate it into like a fake, like, you know, C or Java like syntax. I try to add a lot of diagrams and drawings and stuff like that, as opposed to, you know, getting really deep in code and so on. So learning new ways to communicate was kind of hard. But yeah, then I ended up, I think the end structure that I went with was like, so there's an introduction, it was like a short introduction. And then there were a couple sections where I was like, before I get to, you know, the main thesis work, I'm gonna, or, you know, the main work that I do, I'm gonna back up and talk about kind of motivation, because there's a lot of technical context that's needed for the kind of work that I do. So I did a little bit of this motivation. And then, yeah, so then there was kind of like the initial paper that I wrote. It was kind of its own section on my thesis work. And then there was another section on kind of the work I'd done since then, that made it much better, like really practical and useful for people. And then I actually, so in those sections, I didn't go too deep into any of the technical detail because I really didn't want to lose people. So I would kind of give spoilers, like, and, you know, later on, I'll talk about how I actually do this. But it was mostly focused on kind of the user experience of the tools and motivation and how they work and the results. And then, you know, yeah, just before the last section, there was the like the nerdy section of the talk, which is like, okay, you know, I want people to understand like the hard parts of the work and you know, all the math behind it and so on, if they're interested. But you know, it also kind of gave a signal to the people who were not at all going to like pay attention to that they can zone out for 10 minutes or I think, yeah, 8 minutes or so. Yeah. And then it just got back into, yeah, the future work, like my long-term vision, the kind of short, medium, and long-term plans to get there, and so on. Yeah, I feel like the important part was having like a kind of unifying themes throughout, which sounds a little weird, but like the thing that really tied it together was like I had this like theory and practice slide. And I was kind of talking about how I view this as like a beautiful cycle where, theory informs practice and practice informs theory, etc. Kind of just like a uniform like theme for the way I do research. And then as I spoke about things, I could be like, and here's where the theory goes into the practice. And, here's where the practice actually informs changes in the theory itself, and so on. And this made it very coherent and not just like like a staple job of slides. I think people appreciated that.
I see. Yeah, sounds like you put lots of thought into.
Yeah, it's extremely important. So.
And about your application package, so how did you approach preparing the other statements?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of it was reading. Like I thought of people from the couple of years before me, and who had been successful in the job market, and I contacted them and asked for their materials. And I read a bunch of them just to kind of get examples of the way that people structure things, the things that they talk about. And I think that really helped me form some understanding of what it is that I, need to do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know beyond that. Like all the guides that I read were not super helpful. I really think it was looking at examples and then drafting something and asking, many times for feedback, revisions on that.
Makes sense. I guess there is not really a silver bullet, right?
Yeah.
And what were your considerations when applying for institutions? So did you, for example, only apply for institutions in the US or also beyond?
Yeah, I applied fairly globally. So I applied in the US, Canada, Israel, where I have a lot of family, Denmark, and I wanted to apply in France, but they basically told me if I didn't have a postdoc, that it just wouldn't wouldn't make it, so I shouldn't. Yeah, or it wasn't actually not even a postdoc. I think you have to have your PhD before you apply or something like that. Yeah, the systems around the world are fairly different. Yeah, I actually only ended up really having a lot of success on the US market. So I did have an interview with a university in Denmark, which I enjoyed. It was fun. I think a lot of places, even though they say you don't need a postdoc, if everyone from a European institution or an Israeli institution or whatever who's applying already has a postdoc and you don't, then all the other candidates that you're like competing against have postdocs, and it seems like it's too early to judge how successful of a researcher you'll be. So even though nominally they said, for example, Israeli institutions, like, you should apply for sure, like, we'd, love to have you, etc. They ended up sending me like personal emails, and these Israeli ones that were like, you'd be competitive if you had a postdoc, like, consider applying again in a year.
Okay, that's strange.
It's just the differences in how things work by country and like and what everyone else is doing.
Yeah, and speaking about differences in institutions, so during interviewing, like what kind of differences did you notice in terms of format, for example?
So within the US or internationally, or?
Internationally, for example, I can imagine that interview in Denmark, for example, must have been a bit different than the US interviews.
Yeah, it was quite different. There were way fewer like one-on-one meetings, and it was like almost entirely like meetings with like groups of people, like an entire lab or a committee or something. And yeah, it was a little different. I didn't know what to expect. It was also very structured. It was like I think they had kind of specific things in mind to talk about for some of them. The like lab meetings were much less structured. Yeah, and then you also learn just differences in how these universities work. Like, I don't know, some of the questions that I had to ask back to places interviewing me were kind of American centric, and like the teaching is just so much like the classes that you teach in Denmark, for example, are very structured from the start. So you don't have as much of the freedom to just kind of like do completely your own thing for, designing a course, something. so I had to think a lot about differences, but then at the same time, like questions that I could asking like how are things different in Denmark is a totally valid interview question, and one that for sure I should be asking if I'm applying in Denmark. So there were still good things to talk about.
And what kind of approach did you take for, I mean, again, it's a very general question, but how did you interact with faculty during your one-on-one meetings?
Yeah. Yeah. So I actually, one thing I think helped me a lot, what I did before the interviews is I would go to each of the websites for every faculty that I had meeting with. Um, and I'd print out like the two most interesting papers that they'd published in the last like 5 or so years. And I wouldn't try to read them like front to back, like it just wasn't going to happen. But what I would do was I would read each paper just until I had one interesting thought or question, and I would write that down. And then I had this document that I kept with all these thoughts and questions, and they were really good because they helped me like I'd had a whole bunch of general questions I wanted to ask people. These helped me think about like, who would be the right person to talk about machine learning for proof assistance and like, this particular idea that I have for it. Who might be interested in this idea? Judging from the papers I read, I would sometimes have new research ideas that came up from that. And then I'd be like, I was reading this paper and, I was thinking I want to do this thing. And like, yeah, like a whole research project fell out of like a sequence of 3 of my interviews, reading people's machine learning papers.
Very
So
productive.
it was cool, yeah. So yeah, I would do that. And yeah, and then sometimes asking about their work, sometimes just to inform like what about my work I should emphasize or talk about in the meeting. And then I'd also yeah, think about like list of questions I might want to ask them. They'll always ask you, do you have any questions? And it's nice to have a list of questions and to know like who is a good person to ask certain questions. One thing that stressed me out a lot that I later learned I didn't need to do. So I was very worried that like I had to ask everyone different questions. I was like, will they judge me if I'm asking the same question several times? Like, no, it's actually kind of good to get redundant answers sometimes. So yeah, I didn't have to feel like if I asked a question like that, just crossed out for the day. Like I could do that. Yeah, and then they would ask questions. I had my standard pitch on the research. There are like 2 kinds of one-on-ones. There's the like I saw your talk one-on-one and the I didn't see your talk one-on-one. And I had to have the background on what I do for the I didn't see your talk one-on-one. Which is very important. And yeah, having some future ideas. I kind of the most productive one-on-ones I had, I think, were explicitly. It felt like there was a frame of like we are 2 people working together to like find common ground on research so that we can think of interesting things to do together. And it's just like a mutually enjoyable way. So this is always what I was doing. I was like looking in their papers for common ground, for overlapping interests.
Did you often try to steer the interview or the meeting into this direction? For example, I often had the problem that I read about a person's research and thought about things to bring up, but then during the one-on-one meeting, there was not really time to do this
Oh yeah.
or no good opportunity to bring this up.
Yeah, I think it's not the end of the world if you like if you don't get a chance to bring it up. Like maybe there was just something else you're talking about and it was interesting and that's what they're going to remember. I think that's a really good thing if that happened, and sometimes it did. Then in the follow-up like thank you email, I'd say, oh, by the way, like I had this additional question, we didn't quite have time, I was reading this paper and I was wondering. And then it's nice because it's like your follow-up email is also just very genuine. It's not just a formality because you're trying to get a job. it's a like there's actually something you want to know, and I think people generally appreciate that, even if they don't always have time to send you detailed answers.
Makes sense, yeah. Were there any kind of surprising questions or questions that stuck with you?
That's interesting. I think so. Like the first interview, which is always the hardest. So my first interview was at Caltech, and it was really fun, but there were some questions where I just never thought of them before. And these were not so much questions about my work, because I think it's really hard to ask questions about your thesis work that you've never thought about after, spending so much time working on it. But they were about like how many students do you want? And this is just, it was just never a question I had really thought about before. And people have like large variation. And so, yeah, I mean, after, I think in the first interview, I kind of struggled to answer it because I just didn't even know how to think about that question. But whenever that happened, I would kind of write it down. And then before the next interview, I would really like think about, the answer to this, like have a conversation with my advisor, like what are the trade-offs here? Like how many students do people usually have? And this kind of thing helped.
I see. Yeah, so we chatted now a bit about the interviewing process. So let's continue about hearing back and deciding. And then the first question is, how did you proceed after receiving your first offer?
Yeah, so the first offer actually came very early, and it was one that I was very happy with. But I was very lucky, I think, that they were not going to like rush anything. So I kind of communicated with them like, here's the timeline of the job search, like, here is when I'll have more information. And I don't know, I'm happy that I did negotiate like a couple things later on when I knew that they were like in the running for the last like couple I was considering. But yeah, I did, like, I just asked for a lot of time. I was very transparent about, that. Yeah, there's so much waiting and so much uncertainty. Like things rolled in very slowly, and it changed up like all the way up to the last week of the job search. Yeah, like my UIUC interview came extremely late in this process.
Yeah, guess we
So it
had one
really
of the most unusual periods for interviewing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so UIUC, for example, I think they didn't have their budget approved until very, very late. And so I had already been weighing a couple offers and had kind of decided between those. I think by the time, almost by the time that the like application was open. And there were parts of this that worked out. Like I had a paper that I published like late in the job search process, and it was really nice to be able to apply with this actually being published. And I think it kind of improved my case. But then yeah, it was a very like last minute interview, and then I did one visit where I was like, I'm deciding between this place and maybe UIUC, but I don't know yet. And I would just ask them questions as if I were going to get a UIUC offer, which was very optimistic of me. And felt kind of silly, but like I knew I needed to think of these things ahead of time, or I kind of wouldn't be able to decide if the offer came later. And yeah, it was like at the very end of the process. I think it actually came after the date that I had like wanted to decide already. But I was willing to hold out because I knew it was a really good opportunity, and I was optimistic about it, and like I really enjoyed the interview. I feel like that was you can always write down all these like factors for like which places you like more and so on. And I did all that. Like I had a spreadsheet with my own internal preferences and so on. But the big thing I would notice is really like how much I enjoyed the interview. And the few places that I was really considering at the end, I think were all places where I just had a lot of fun. Yeah.
Okay, that's good advice. Follow your gut feeling. And before accepting the offer, did you do any negotiation?
Yeah. So what I really liked is we had a Slack channel for all the faculty candidates in computer science. And we understood the game theory behind it. So like we had a spreadsheet with like first of all, like who is getting like it'd be anonymous, but it'd be like interviews, offers, etc. So you could kind of track like, oh, this university has started interviewing people. So I probably don't actually have a shot there or something. It's not always true. Like sometimes they pick people up late, but um, yeah, you could kind of track that. But then once offers came in, we made another spreadsheet where you could put in details of your offers, and this gave me a nice like sense of what people were getting at other places, what kinds of things they were negotiating for, and then we would also talk to each other about that negotiation process. So yeah, I mean, the big thing was like, so again, like the admin thing, like the frame that I like is like, what do you need to succeed? And for me, that the administrative help was there. So like, I asked for a bump in startup. And then when I had a couple offers where I was like really actually torn, I would ask for matching. I felt weird doing this. I like um, it was like an internal crisis for me. It felt strange. It went against like all the all my internal feelings, but I also kind of knew that this is, look, if we were like this is the most equitable thing. Like I should be doing it. So
Yes.
I would I would ask for matching if I were torn, and places were generally happy to do that. And also, honestly, it just gave me a really good impression if they were happy to do it. Like one of the things that was nice about UIUC kind of was how it felt, how out of their way it felt like they were willing to go to make sure that I had everything that I needed to get started successfully. And that made me feel like, oh, I actually can succeed here. And yeah.
I guess it's also true for everyone that negotiating is not a very pleasant thing to do or to initiate, right? So I also
Yeah.
found it
Yeah.
difficult to do.
Yeah. Yeah, there's small things too, like start date. So yeah, I mean, startup is the one that most people negotiate, especially to match other places, and to handle any hardware needs you have. My hardware needs are very low, so this isn't as much of a thing. But like one thing I didn't think about is like different universities take they take some like money off of your grants, but then some of them will give you some of it back as like discretionary spending. I don't know. The universities are strange. And the percent that you get back from that overhead in the US varies like from like 0 to like 10%. And this is pretty significant. So I actually, because I knew I had a grant coming in, I would ask places about what that number is. And then I would, if it was lower, basically like the highest number that I had out of places I was strongly considering, I would ask other places to bump the startup uh, to like match that, which is a really small amount, but it just felt like I didn't want money to be a consideration um, as much as how I felt like I fit into a department and how I would succeed and the students I would get and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a good question also then to ask, like, what's the percentage that you have to give to the university when getting a grant?
Yeah, and then also how much of that they give you back as discretionary. It's really
Right.
strange. It's a question that you ask like a chair or something, or I don't know. I get confused between chair questions and dean questions, but it's one of those.
Yeah, to wrap up as a final question, what kind of suggestions can you share with future faculty candidates?
I would say the biggest thing that I would do like as early as possible is talk to people outside of your research area about your research. It's so easy during your PhD to really like get wrapped up in your one community doing this really specific thing and never learn how to explain program verification to a machine learning researcher or something like this. And I think it's important for the job search, and I think it's also just important for your research. Like you just get new perspectives, new technologies, new ideas that can be really exciting. So yeah, what I wish I'd done, I think, much earlier is like, and what I hope to set up when I'm, faculty, is like having students um, from totally different labs just kind of meet up for like a 30-minute one-on-one and coffee, like once a month, maybe a different person every month from a different lab, and just like, just explain your research to each other, just
Mm.
talk. And it's just such an important skill, and like it's really nice if you develop it ahead of time.
Okay, yeah, then thank you so much, Talia, for sharing all of this, and it was
Yeah,
great
thanks for
talking to
having
you.
me.